Welcome to the Everything Made Beautiful podcast with Shannon Scott. This program is sponsored by Kava, home of streaming Bible studies, teaching series, and workshops to deepen your faith. Check them out at Kava, QAVA.tv. And now, on with the show.
Well, hey there, and welcome back to the Everything Made Beautiful podcast. Today we get the privilege of hearing from my friend, Dr. Jason Young. Jason has spent over 25 years working alongside well-respected churches and companies, and he partners with them to ask important questions, listen to the presenting problems, build a psychologically safe space, clarify the best way to solve their challenges, and help execute a plan that works for them. With an earned doctoral degree in hospitality and working on his PhD in leadership trauma, he is a nationally recognized guest experience consultant and leadership guide, keynote speaker, best-selling author, and university professor. Through experience, research, and education, he's developed strategies to help people understand people because most organizational challenges require relational solutions. He loves to guide people and teams to gain a better understanding of who they are, what they already have, find ways to gain momentum, and help them rediscover what it means to thrive. I've been a personal beneficiary of Jason's leadership expertise, and I'm thankful to know him as well as his beautiful wife, Stacy. Jason and Stacy also have 2 children, Bella and Jake. Today we're going to talk about his latest book, Don't Burn Out, Burn Bright. Because if we aren't operating at peak efficiency and taking care of ourselves, it is bound to catch up with us in a big way. This conversation was an encouragement and a challenge to me, and I hope it'll be the same for you. So lean in for this conversation with my friend, Dr. Jason Young. Well, Jason Young, Dr. Jason Young, should I call you Dr. Jason?
Well, you can get anything off the internet, so.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for being on the Everything Made Beautiful podcast. This is a conversation that I have wanted to have with you. In fact, before I ever launched this podcast, many months ago, maybe a year ago now, I said, I want you on a guest I want you on as a guest when I start my podcast. So I'm glad that we're getting to do this. Thank you for saying yes.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you, Shannon.
Well, so I've given your official bio that everybody has heard, but I am excited because I know how much you have to offer, and I know we won't get it all today, which makes me sad, but I know that we're going to get a lot, which is great because you and I met when I was on a leadership team at the school our kids were in Loganville Christian Academy, and you were doing leadership coaching and development for us. And I knew you and of you before that, but I got to see you really in your gifting as a leadership coach, just coaching our team at that school, and have loved everything that you have done since then. I have followed it closely, and you have a book. You have several books, and everyone should read them all, and I will put them in the show notes. But today, I want to talk about your book, Don't Burn Out, Burn Bright, that you wrote with Jonathan Malm. And I love this book. I have quotes from it. I have all kinds of questions, but I just would love to start with, why did you write it? What's the basic premise of it? And then I'd love to dig into some things. And before you answer, I'll say this. Anytime I see something with the word burnout, my interest is piqued. And I don't think that's because I'm in burnout, but I do think there have been many seasons of my life where I have probably been burnout adjacent. And so there's something that kind of calls to me when there's a solution to that feeling. And so that's one of the reasons I'm grateful for this. So take it away.
Yeah. Well, a fun part of the story that rarely gets told is the publisher actually rejected the idea to begin with. And It was a bit frustrating because they said, and I had already done 4 books with them, and they said, the market is saturated. And so kind of did some research, and in their defense, they were right. The market was saturated. However, then why was burnout still rising? And the rejection, and that might be a dramatic word, but the hey, cute, but no thanks response was actually really helpful, because what I discovered kind of stepping back and revisiting things was, you know what? They were right. A lot of books are written about burnout on the back end. You're here, what do you do now? But there were not a lot of books on the front end of, what if I didn't even have to get to the back end? Like, is there a
Yeah.
way, if I've got to put enter the front end or back end, what if I could choose the front end? So we literally took the book, inverted it, and said, you know what? This is more about how to prevent burnout. And maybe not even that. It's really, how do you protect, how do you keep your joy in work and life? And so that's kind of how it came to fruition. The driver of the book, neither of us, Jonathan and I, were at a place of burnout. So that isn't really where it came from, but it did come from working with people who were experiencing it. I think I was experiencing a little bit of the exhaustion side. So in looking back, and then as I thought about phrases I heard in undergrad and grad and different educational programs, it was like burnout was this badge of honor, because that means you laid it all out. You gave it all, right? And so if you
Mm.
did that, it just is like a byproduct, and like it is what it is. And that's where one of the phrases began to surface. And burnout in leadership is not inevitable. Like, we don't have to accept it that way. And so kind of the birth of this book came about of, if it's not inevitable, what can we do to actually not get there and keep up our joy?
That's such an interesting point that that you made of like, yes, the market was saturated, but it wasn't working. And so just because there's a lot of information out there about something, if the problem's not being solved, then there's always room for solutions. That's so good. So for the purposes of this, just would you define burnout for this conversation? And then what are some of the warning signs that you may be approaching burnout?
Yeah, I might even take two steps back from
Yeah.
burnout. So burnout's one of those things, and this isn't new to anybody. Anybody listening, watching right now, like you'll say, "Oh yeah, of course." We don't like wake up and burn out. Like, how did I get here? It's like it's overnight. Two steps back from that, if you think of kind of progression, we all experience stress, and stress is rather normal. Like, it's where we can worry or have mental tension because there's been a difficult situation. Could be something in your family, work, finances, something inside of you nobody knows about. So you have this stress. Well, that, if we're not careful, snowballs, and we could find ourselves at a place of exhaustion. And when you think about like exhaustion, it's like um, the stress has kind of stayed around a little longer, or the stress has accumulated a little bit too much. But if we can adjust a few levers, like hobbies, calendar, sleep, um, exercise, like, if we can move a few levers, we can actually bounce back to a healthier place. So stress, exhaustion, and then that's where we find ourselves in burnout. And burnout, in essence, is it's a psychological syndrome that comes as a result of being exposed to an enormous amount of stress for a prolonged period of time. So I didn't deal with it when it was just stress. I didn't deal with it when it was just exhaustion. So I find myself at a place of burnout that warning signs could include, I don't care about things or people like I used to. Why? I can't
Mm.
figure it out. I have incredible brain fog. My energy is like, just, it's down in the dumps. I'm constantly discouraged. I notice increased irritability, especially with people close to me. I'm not as creative, or I'm not an idea generator maybe like I used to. I don't lack courage. I mean, I don't have courage. I actually lack it. So I'm unwilling to try new things. And on the spiritual side, I don't even really want to spend time with God, because it boils down to this. I just ain't got nothing left in the tank. So here's what's interesting. With exhaustion, you can bounce back from it, but you cannot bounce back from burnout. You crawl out of burnout because you don't have anything left in the tank. And so the
Wow.
idea of this book is, what if we could prevent that? And even if you're there, this book is still for you. What can we do incrementally to be encouraging and helpful so you can have that joy that you used to have?
Wow, that's I'm literally I have to say I've done a lot of these podcasts and I'm taking notes in real time instead of just going, I got to go back and listen to that. I'm literally writing stuff down. So we live in a culture, though, that glorifies
Mm,
hustle.
yes.
Um, in fact, I mentioned at some point that in this kind of new season I've embarked on of, I've left a church staff that I loved and now I'm kind of on my own, quote unquote. But I said to someone, um, I really feel a conviction that I'm not supposed to hustle my way into whatever is next. And the person
Mm,
stopped me, who meant well, and said, I don't think you mean hustle. I think you mean striving, because
mm,
scripture says to cease striving. But I did mean hustle. Like
uh-huh.
there's a glorification of hustle that if I'm not careful will overtake me. It just
Yeah.
will, because I'm a high capacity, high performing, high I want to take lots of ground, and I will be a slave to hustle. So in the book, the first quote that I wrote down is, this was about hustle, and you said, seasons of intense hard work are part of any high performing leadership role. The problem is when hustle becomes a lifestyle instead of a short term sprint to accomplish a goal.
Yeah.
So, talk a little bit about, yes, stress, exhaustion, and then eventually burnout. But when you live in a culture or work in a role that glorifies hustle and hard work, how do you find that balance?
Yeah. Uh, so if you're listening to this podcast right now, sometimes this is self-inflicted because it comes to a belief or approving of, and then other times you unfortunately you're stuck in a work culture that almost demands it or worse, rewards it.
Hmm.
And so I remember working on a church staff, and I think the leader of the org meant well, but it was like Jason became kind of this banner guy of working hard and getting stuff done. I mean, Jason like goes to bed at 12 or 12:30 and gets up at 4. And I think the leader meant well by it. Unfortunately, it backfired because the questions were, is that guy really healthy? Like, do I really want to be that guy? And you
Yeah.
know what the reality was? If the truth were told, like, I probably wasn't the healthiest version of myself because I am a hard worker, but it was actually being rewarded. What we don't do is we don't reward healthy. The reason we don't, I think, or part of it, is we actually don't even know what it looks like.
Yeah.
Whereas the hustle, okay, sleep, you work a lot of hours, you produce a lot of stuff, like you're visible, like those are almost like palpable things. And so like that's easier to define. But when we think about healthy is who gets introduced in a staff meeting. This is the person that knows how to say no to meetings and has wonderful boundaries. We want to celebrate this person. Like that, I've never seen that because
No.
so why don't we don't celebrate that? So the idea we do sometimes demand hustle, we reward hustle. I'm all about working hard. I mean, I'm a hard worker. Like I know you're a hard worker. We have hard workers listening to us. And I think we're designed to work hard in sprints,
Yeah.
but I don't think that we have the capacity. Our shoulders aren't strong enough. Our hearts aren't strong enough for this to go on and on and on and on. And some people have actually disagreed with me when they read that part of the book. They're like, well, I'm built differently. I'm like, well, I do believe the same person that built you built me.
Yeah, that's good.
And so when we think about how we're designed, I think we're designed that we can do things in seasons, but we have to be careful what we adopt as our lifestyle. Like, what are the practices and beliefs and stories and things like that that become our lifestyle? That maybe the dark side of this whole thing is I think sometimes we do stuff like this because we need what comes from it.
Ooh,
So
say more.
yeah, I do stuff. I want to do it, but I do stuff like this because I get acknowledgement from it. I do stuff like this because there's something satisfying that I built XYZ, or I get more applause, or I'm proving myself versus I'm adding value to the org or to my team or to my family, right? So really at that point it comes down like, well, what's my motive in this whole thing? So I do think that we live in the hustle hurry. And I'm not even saying, again, I think we should work hard. And maybe we have to hurry in a season, but I don't think we were made to do this as a lifestyle. And I've done this for many, many, many years. And I'm like, and we could talk about this later, but I think I have done better at that because I think the Lord convicted me. I didn't design you to do this. This is your thing.
Yeah.
So, like, how could I imagine a better way?
It's interesting that you mentioned hurrying because I've heard people say you just don't see any evidences in scripture that Jesus was ever in a hurry. Like he was never just rolling through the, quickly, I got to get to the next meeting. Like more often he stayed where he was. Or
Yeah,
he delayed,
yeah,
he quote delayed. Um, and when somebody pointed that out, I thought, yeah, even apart from Jesus, you just don't see God in a hurry uh, throughout Scripture. So that is really good. I like that you said value add to the organization or the team or the family, because I think
mm,
it'd be easy for maybe some people watching or listening to be like, oh, well, that doesn't apply to me because I don't work outside the home. But you and I both have spent a lot of time also in the education space and have seen our share of parents
mm,
whose hustle is often connected to the amount of things that
yeah,
family is doing and those kids are doing.
yeah,
Almost like it's a badge of honor to be more involved in everything and
yeah,
indicative of laziness to say, ah, we're just not going to do that. We're not going to enroll so and so in that. We're not going to take part in that. We're not going to show up to that. So I'm glad that you said family because I do think this is for everybody. It's just a matter of
hmm.
what sphere for you it impacts.
Well, and sometimes we this statement is something we adopt. I do more, so I am more,
Mm,
and it's like, well, who told you that? Like, is that true? And so, like, I just keep doing because it's like doing is elusive. It's like, well, I'm gonna do enough. Well, what's enough? It's like perfectionism, right? This is something I struggle with. True vulnerability, confession moment. Like, but it's like I know it's not a real thing because like it's elusive. As soon as I get close, it moves, right? And you like I've never caught it. And I think sometimes this hustle idea is you never catch it, but I can promise you it will catch up with you.
yeah.
So
Yeah. You mentioned perfectionism. That's literally the next quote that I took from the book because we both know that I struggle with perfectionism. I used to say I was a recovering perfectionist, but I'm not
yeah,
sure I'm ever going to recover from that particular struggle. But you said on perfectionism, if you strive for perfection, you'll never hit it and you'll always be frustrated, which is true.
yeah,
But when the goal is improvement, you can actually see progress and have something worth celebrating.
yeah,
And that has been helpful to me. I wrote it down because a lot of people will say it's you don't need to go for perfectionism, you need to go for good enough, and man, that kills me. That
yeah,
sounds like settling for
yes,
less than the
yes,
best. But when the goal is improvement, did I improve this
yeah,
or is this an improved contribution to what was before? That has been more helpful for me than it's good enough. I don't even know how to wrap my mind around that.
yeah. Well, and when you think about perfectionism, again, there's so much material out that smarter people than myself understanding like what drives that. And maybe there's an element of of fear, the way you were always asked this question when I work with leaders, like what's something in your childhood that shows up as an adult, right? And this actually shows up a lot. It's like, where did it come from? And sometimes perfectionism though is like you want to be perceived in a certain way. And so you can
Yeah.
control that narrative. If you can keep things just so, you can control that. So again, on the hustle side, same here is sometimes there's a motive element that we may or may not know about. It's not always the case, but it can often be the case, and something for us to kind of like hold up a mirror and go like, well, what is it for me?
Yeah. Yeah. To be perceived as good. Yeah,
Yeah.
totally. Um, I want to ask you about the concept of work-life balance
Mm-hmm.
because I've been in places that say we want you to have that, but they don't do anything to help you have it. I've
Yeah.
also been in places who have flat out said, we don't believe in that. So that is not what we're going for here. I worked somewhere where they said we don't use the word balance because we don't think that's real. So I would just love, and probably everybody listening is on some line of that spectrum. But what do you think about the concept of work life balance? Is that a thing, or is that just theater that we're all doing, trying to hit something that doesn't exist?
Well, obviously, I'm just another opinion in the crowd. Um, there are people who, study this far more. I think I go back years ago to a conversation I had with a sociologist. He was a speaker at a conference. I was responsible for hosting him. I was driving him back to the airport, Atlanta airport one day, and we actually got in this conversation about work-life balance. And it's funny, we use these buzzwords, but sometimes it's like he asked me, he goes, "What is that?" I'm like, "Hey, I'm asking you the questions." He was like, "Oh, no, what is that? Like, what is work-life balance?" I'm like, "Oh, where you balance work and life?" He goes, "Like, what is that?" And it was interesting. He was even challenging because he was challenging what I was asking by the words I chose because language tells us how to behave, right? So if
Mm,
work-life balance is the language you use, you're going to behave. And it was a great challenge because he said this. He said, "How do you know when you get to a work-life balance? And then how do you keep it, assuming things don't stay the same? How do you know?"
mm,
I had no answer for this guy.
yeah.
So I said, "I'm assuming you have another option." He goes, "I do." He goes, "I don't know. I don't know." His name's Dr. Leonard Sweet. He goes, I don't know how to do the work life balance. He goes, "Maybe other people have figured out." He goes, "But what I have figured out is rhythms in life that I can actually get my arms around, that I can be intentional about and respond to." He goes, "Now that I can explain more. So I know the rhythm of, let's say I'm going to be working on a particular project. It's going to demand more time, more people. Like I could talk about it more in a more tangible way, you know. So it was an interesting idea. It might be something. I will tell you this, Shannon. I have never in my life, I could not give you an example. If you were to say, "Jason, give me a time when you thought you had a good work life balance." I don't even know what it means because it's another thing that's abstract. So for
Yeah.
me, I think I've fallen more into the category of what do the rhythms of my life look like? Could be work, could be spiritual matters, could be, projects, right? Like it could be different things. That I could define more and that I can control more and that I can realize, you know what? I need to slow this one down, this rhythm, or hey, heads up, rhythm's going to pick up. It's a season. So it feels like it's a little bit more of a palpable thing than an abstract thing that work life balance is to me. But I'm just another opinion.
No, I mean, that resonates with me. I mean, this is called the Everything Made Beautiful podcast because we are committed to the idea that there is a season for everything. And
Mm-hmm.
so, if there is a season for everything, then everything is not the same all the
Mm.
time. And so, it's really profound to think about there's not a balance you're always going to have, but you are going to have the appropriate time for the season. And there are seasons for hard work, but the sprint, not a marathon, is both freeing but it's also empowering because it's like, yeah, I need to work hard for this season and then it will be over. And there's a time for that ebb and flow to happen, which brings up the conversation about boundaries.
Mm,
And this sentence, you actually said this when you were doing leadership development with us, and I'm glad it's in this book. A boundary should be a gate and not a wall. So
hmm.
talk a little bit about that as we think about, okay, I'm not going to burn out. I've got to make sure I'm managing stress and exhaustion before I have to figure out how to solve burnout. What does
Hmm.
the role of boundaries play in that, and them being gates and not walls?
Yeah, so the imagery here is whenever I've heard of a boundary, I've always heard of it in like concrete terminology or imagery that it's a wall that stays out, this stays in, done deal. And maybe, but maybe there's like another way. And the gate idea is what if for this season or this rhythm, that thing is not to be part of this. And so, as a gate, it allows movement in and out for me to decide about that particular thing. So, when I think of like how I've been taught boundary, this huge wall as tall as you can build it, stay out. And there are some things. I mean, I think about some of you listening, you have family members that you've had to establish a really, really hard boundary, or maybe something at work, or maybe places you go or don't go, right? So there's these, that's why I say, like, I'm not saying it's not a thing, but the gate idea is what if everything's not meant to be on the outside or the inside permanently?
Mm.
And so the gate allows maybe some movement and not finality. Some things might need to be, and that's fine, but not everything needs to be. And so the gate idea allows maybe the movement to happen in and out, again, based on how I'm seeing and needing things, that allows me more flexibility versus the permanency idea of, you stay there, I stay here, period, kind of like a cutoff. um, so it's just a little bit different imagery. Boundaries specifically, we could talk about this all day. You know, uh, Henry Cloud wrote a remarkable book. So, I mean, he adds way more to the conversation. I think for this particular book, one of the things that we have seen a lot with leaders is how do you establish healthy relational boundaries?
Mm.
So, you know, this could show up. I mean, let's make this super practical. This could show up with how many yeses and nos you distribute. This could show up in meeting time. This could show up in when you email or don't email your team members. This could be when you text or call or don't your team members. So it could be very, very practical like that. When you think about relational boundaries, there's an element of isolating that's not necessarily the goal. There's an element more of protecting what is good, right? And the good may be, I need to kind of protect this around me. I will say this, and I've noticed this the last few years. I'm not sure why, but I have noticed that people are weaponizing boundaries in order to isolate people that they might need in their life that are actually healthy, but
Mm.
they are isolating them. So they're weaponizing using, well, I'm creating a boundary. And so it's keeping the good out in order so I can kind of protect what I want to do when I want to do it. And so I think that we have to be careful of like, how are we using this? And is it actually for a healthier version of myself or ourselves as a team? Does that make any sense?
It does. And isn't it amazing how we will weaponize anything? Like,
Yeah.
I think we have a tendency as humanity to, I mean, isn't that the whole story of the fall? It's like we will take anything good and pervert it. And I don't just mean that sexually, but
Yeah.
pervert it, the intended use or application into something that is outside that. I think of, personality tests and Enneagram and all those things, like the more, knowledge we get, the more we are tempted to weaponize it, and
Yeah.
use it in a way it wasn't intended. And I think boundaries, because when somebody says, I'm establishing a boundary, we immediately go, oh gosh, they're doing something healthy, so I definitely should not ask any more questions. And that may not necessarily be the case. So that's a good
Yeah.
warning to ensure
Yeah.
we're not weaponizing it.
Yeah, and sometimes it's all in how we respond. I think sometimes people we don't do a boundary because we don't want to let people down or we don't want to hurt people or and it's not like you have to be rude like no, absolutely not. This is my boundary. Like I'm not even advocating for language or approaches like that, but if somebody asks you something, I appreciate the fact that you asked me. I'm unable to do it, but I appreciate the thoughtfulness and the invitation, because whatever you could say because of scheduling, whatever. So it's not like I have to be hard about it. And I think sometimes it gets a bad rap that in order to establish a boundary, it's like it's a hardcore thing. Um,
Yeah.
so it's something to explore because I do see, especially with leaders, there's this idea that's very real of emotional labor that you're so used to listening to the emotions of other people that it becomes an element, it becomes laborious, it's labor, it's
Yeah.
work for you.
Yes. It's heavy.
who do it's heavy. Who does that for you, right? And
Yeah.
so maybe a boundary for you could look like not that you say no to them, but maybe you don't take on as much of that. Let's say 5 times a day you listen to 3 people a day, but you also set up a boundary for yourself that I'm also going to have so and so to help me. That would be an example of a boundary. So again, it gets a bad rap that it's like this hard, mean thing, but it could look a lot of different ways and it could still be soft and caring.
Yeah. Before we move away from this, I do just want to say to people listening or watching, anytime we talk about communication, inside an organization or otherwise, any communication, it's always a good rule of thumb to ask yourself a few questions before communicating, like
Mm,
who needs to hear this? How do they need to hear it? And when do they need to hear it? And possibly who do they need to hear it from?
mm,
And those are just ways to avoid accidental injury in the way that we communicate by doing it in the wrong way at the wrong time through the wrong medium or with the wrong person. In
yeah.
considering boundaries, it might be good if you're feeling an unrest to consider, do I need to set a boundary? And if so, does it need to be a wall or a gate? Does it need to
Mm,
be permanent or flexible? Is
mm-hmm,
this for a season? Just those sorts of questions,
mm-hmm,
because again, it's similar to perfectionism is something we'll never attain. Boundaries do not have to be a wall, an impenetrable wall for all of
mm,
time in many cases. And
mm-hmm.
so hopefully there's some freedom there for those of you who feel the need to set a boundary but didn't realize it didn't have to be permanent.
Yeah, yeah, that's true.
um, so another thing I wrote down, this is a little bit of a left turn, but
Mm-hmm,
you talk about comparison
mm,
and say comparison is the death of true self contentment. So,
mm-hmm,
comparison is the death of true self contentment. Leaders often struggle with comparing themselves to others, especially with the rise of social media, but focusing on one's own journey is key to avoiding burnout.
mm.
I thought the comparison idea was interesting in a book on burnout. And then I was like, oh, well, of course. I mean, why wouldn't that be part of it? So just talk a little bit about comparison is the death of true self contentment.
Yeah. I mean, again, it's not revolutionary in the sense that like, wow, this is the first time I've ever heard this. I mean, we've heard about comparison and there's been some remarkable pastors and writers that have talked about, how it's a trap, um, how it's a thief, right? Steals joy. Like all of that has come before us. And I think this is actually a real challenge for leaders is that we fall in love with knowledge.
Mm,
And all the way back to Adam and Eve, that they actually prioritize knowledge over God. So from the very beginning, humanity has just been in love with the idea of knowledge. And I think sometimes what happens is social media, emails, reading, like in fact, in this book, we talk about like even in a book, like maybe you need to stop reading. Maybe you need to stop social media. Maybe you need to stop now, listen to only this podcast, but maybe you need to abandon podcasts for a season. Like the whole purpose is we're saturated with knowledge,
Yeah, so good.
but I don't know how driven we are with intentional action. Or one book I read talked about deliberate practice. And so we scroll and we scroll and we scroll and we read and we read and we read and we hear and we hear and we hear. And for what? And so sometimes if we're not careful in all of that, we begin to think of thoughts like this: I'm not further along than I should be, or like they are, or I should have done this already, or I don't have that, or my church isn't as big as theirs, or as many campuses, or as many staff, or I'm not speaking at all those conferences like I thought I would, or I'm not making as much money, or I don't have the family elements I thought that I would have by now, or you start comparing. I don't write like so and so, or I'm not, look at the vacation. I mean, comparison can have 50,000 different
Yeah.
tentacles to it, but at the core of it, and this is so hard. I read a book written by Puritans, and it talked about contentment. And I'm not saying Jason lives a content life. I think maybe this is in the book because this is a struggle for me, that I have to be very careful of, when I'm feeling some sort of way, am I feeling some sort of way because I'm comparing myself, or I'm feeling some sort of way because I'm leaning in a content manner? Well, I don't even have to ask myself the question. I know the answer. It's like usually the first way. So, one, it's realizing that it is a reality, and two, it's what do I need, or how might I not battle comparison so much and find myself more times being content. Again, are you going to perfect this? Not happening. But is there a way that I could be more content more often with what I do have and who I do have than I find myself comparing, which typically lets me go down a vortex of what I don't have? Another idea. We often say this, well, I love to celebrate other people. When I see their stuff, they new campus, more staff, conference, they got this gig. And sometimes I want to say to people when I hear them say that, even myself, are you really happy for them? Like, are you, if nobody else was around, are you deeply content with where you are? And when you saw that, you didn't compare yourself thinking, well, that should be me. And so on the front, your front face, your posture is, oh yeah, Shannon, good job, celebrating you. But deep down inside, there's this discontent that, why don't I get that? So if that's you, it's a real battle. And if you do battle it, you're welcome to humanity. But we don't have to
Yeah.
stay there. So it's not something we have to accept. I think we have to do the deliberate practice of thinking of boundaries. Are there things I need to put in my life that don't put me exposed to comparison as much as I am now? And I could begin to think, what am I content with, and with whom? And maybe begin to talk about those things and write those things and share those things, so I can have that more on my radar than only comparison.
Yeah, so good. Well, the last quote I wrote is probably going to be helpful for so many, because we've talked about things like hustle and perfectionism and comparison and boundaries. And so for a certain personality type, now we're going, okay, well, I know everything that's wrong with it, but I'm not sure what happens now.
Yeah.
And you write extensively on rest. And so that's how I
Mm,
want us to wrap up. And you said the way you recharge your emotional energy is through rest. Rest
hmm.
limits the time we have to work on something, so it helps us focus on the things that matter most.
Yeah,
So for people who are recognizing, okay, I do have a lot of stress because that is just the human experience. I even maybe am exhausted, or I'm so exhausted that when he talked about burnout, that's actually what resonated more with me was the I just don't care, frankly. I
yeah.
have nothing left. Um, is rest the antidote to all of those things?
Mm,
And what does it look like in the culture we all live in that does not prioritize rest, though we may have a lot of good books and blogs and podcasts about it? How do we achieve true rest and start to push back some of this burnout, or the previous exhaustion and stress?
yeah. When you think about how each of us, how it was designed to be, it was this really this element of shalom and this wholeness, right? And part
Mhm.
of that is rest. To be whole, the challenge is society, culture, books. If you work on a church staff, it rarely is the thing that gets celebrated or promoted or encouraged. In fact, I've worked at places where it was discouraged
Mhm.
in the name of doing godly work, godly things. And it's like, wait a minute. So
And I
when we
will
think
also
about,
say I've been at places where it was celebrated and encouraged from the platform, but
mm,
then you have the staff or the volunteers sitting there going, "Wait, what?"
yeah,
So I think it's, which I don't think was manipulative in any way.
yeah,
I think it is a misunderstanding that this is not predominantly the human experience.
yeah. Look, on the front end, some of this is self-inflicted. Like we could do this to ourselves if we're not careful, and we usually don't do it overnight. It's like at 2 a.m. it shows up, knock on the door, and say, "Oh, didn't see it coming." We don't see it coming, but it's the small incremental decisions we make that can often contribute to accelerating the acceleration to get to this point. So there's kind of an organizational and an individual thing. On the individual side, it is taking a little bit of an inventory. If you're exhausted or if you're burned out, maybe you're just experiencing some stress or some of these warning signs we've talked about. And maybe it's talking with someone in a trusted way. Look, you as a leader, you're gonna have a voice that's gonna tell yourself, I need to put on the front that I've got it all together and I'm okay. And if you're not. And so having a conversation with somebody that's trusted and you begin to navigate some of these things, one of the things almost always rest is not happening. But what's sad that I often hear from leaders in church and outside of church is they don't say it like this, but this is where we end up. Rest is like a sin. I don't
Mm,
deserve to rest. There's work to do. He needs me. God needs me. And it's like, who said that? For me, it was people in my undergrad and grad program that they probably meant well, but it wasn't presented well. Or it's like, oh, I don't know if that's true. So when you think about rest, it could look like a calendar shift, or it could look like you doing things that bring you satisfaction. It could look like, here's a sign. This is a little humorous. Have you ever had a meeting scheduled and you receive a notification or a text message that that meeting gets canceled and you just got
oh,
30 minutes back in your day and you're like, it's almost like a visceral response and you get this feeling in your body? Okay, that's a problem because we're so stacked with stuff
yeah.
that the
Feels like
only way
winning
to,
the lottery if it
oh
gets
yeah,
canceled.
it's like you're so stacked that the only way to get a break is if someone else cancels something on your calendar and you're like, oh, this is so good, I got a break. Like, but a lot of us are there. So we are tired and we do need to rest. So sometimes that is, for me, I change my sleep schedule After 7, 10 years of 12:30 at night, going to bed, getting up at 4 a.m., I know that's not good. So I changed that. That's one thing for me in the whole learning process and maturing process as a leader and as a spouse and a father and as a friend. Like, okay, I'm not the best version of me staying like this, right? What started out in a season went to a lifestyle.
Mm.
And so it could be getting more
Now
sleep.
people are going to ask, what are the hours? What are the
Yeah,
good
so
hours?
I may still do like 11:30 or 12, but it might be like, 5:30, it could be 6:30, there's a little bit more there's longer hours there for me.
Yeah.
Um and so it's better. It could be taking a nap, it could be rest, could be not stacking your schedule, it could be doing things that satisfy. There's different ways. Rest is not always about, well, if I could just get rid of meetings. Well, you know what? Here, if I'm a betting guy, I bet if we cleared up some meetings, you would find more stuff to do on that calendar.
Yeah,
I'm,
that's good.
it would be a bet. So it's practicing the things. And you know what? There's probably in the beginning, you're going to feel guilty about it, especially if you've trained yourself to not do it because you didn't feel like, well, I don't deserve it, or it's a sin. You say, well, that sounds dramatic. I've heard people like, I got a lot to do, as if the world depends on you. If Jesus demonstrated that for us, which he did, and we even see that in creation, there has to be something there because it must be like we need it.
Yeah.
And I'm not that good to not need something that Jesus himself needed.
Yeah.
And as soon as I begin to think I don't, there is an element that I elevate myself above someone and something that I have no business doing. And I need to humble myself and realize I need rest. It shows up different ways, but we all need it. And it can be a massive antidote to burnout and keeping your joy.
There's something really arrogant about my belief that I can't rest or things will fall apart. I mean, frankly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, the earth is not held by me. The
Yeah.
concerns of life are not held by me. They're held by someone much more resourced to hold them because he made
Yeah.
them. And I have, I take that Psalm 23 passage of he makes me lie down in green pastures,
Mm.
sometimes a little aggressively, like if I get sick or if I get to where I can't do anything but lie down and he made me lie down. It's
Yeah.
amazing how many things keep going. But I do feel like some of us have to be sick before we stop. And I have to get to the bottom of that for myself regularly. Because sometimes we need to stop just because we need to stop and be
Yeah.
reminded that it doesn't all depend on us actually. But there's a
Yeah.
guilt with it,
Yeah.
and it's true. There is guilt and it'll be fine.
It, yeah, it is. I'll tell you a brief story, and maybe if you're listening, you can identify with this, or you may just say, Jason, bro, you got problems, which that is true as well. I, talking about being sick, this was a sick move. I was working on a church staff. It was Easter, right? It's the Super Bowl. It's
Super
crazy, right?
Bowl. Yeah.
You're adding like 400,000 more services. You're getting ready, right? So like I'm feeling good about it. We got the plan. And I get sick. And when I say get sick, I get pneumonia, bronchitis, and strep the week of Easter. Not good when you work on a church staff. So I did the most noble thing imaginable. I showed up to work and with a temperature. So I had all that
Mm,
happening for what? Like,
yeah.
what story did I tell myself that it hinged on whether I was there or not? And even when I was sick with all that junk, I still wasn't willing to rest. Now, I love the work that I do, but I don't know that it was all about love that in that season. I think
Yeah.
it was like I elevated myself too highly and like, by golly, I'm gonna. So that's a problem. And
Yeah.
hopefully I have matured since then. My wife's like, "What is wrong with you?" I'm like, "Well, you got all day because I got a lot of stuff to tell you." But I realize, like, yeah, that is a problem, and we shouldn't have to be sick to force us to rest. But if we choose to rest, then maybe we actually become more of who He designed us to be because He designed rest.
Yeah, that's so good. I I think I find that predominantly things that I fear will happen if I take a break never actually do. Like the worst case scenario never actually comes true. But in the handful of times where I've needed to take a break, I've taken it and it wasn't received well by someone on the other side. It wasn't long before God was showing me that that wasn't a relationship that needed
Mm,
cultivating over the long term anyway.
mm,
um, the majority of people understand and will be supportive of rest and margin in the calendar.
yeah.
Um, oh, this is so good. So I have one question for you before we go, but before
Yep.
that,
Yep.
um, what I just think about the people who are already in burnout, who
Yeah.
are listening, going, "This would have been great to hear 6 months ago, perhaps."
Yeah.
What are the first steps that someone who is in burnout currently could take to begin this process of just rebuilding their emotional and relational strength?
Yeah. Let me see if I can briefly mention a couple things. One, um, there's an assessment. Don't burn out, burn bright. There's actually an assessment there. And when you take the assessment, it gives you one result. And that one result, again, hopefully it's accurate. The one result is where the thing that could be leading you into burnout or is keeping you in burnout. And then it corresponds to a chapter in the book. So I don't even care if you read the whole book, but maybe you read that one chapter because it's the thing that maybe have you most entangled. Okay, so that's idea number one.
I'll
Idea
put
number
all that
two,
in the show notes.
idea number two, and this is even a bigger picture. If you're in burnout and you're listening to this, you don't you struggle with I know, okay, I know I want to, but I don't even have any energy to like take the first step. And that's okay because here's a different way to look at that. Burnout is really a traumatic experience. And by that, when you think about trauma, and if you were to study trauma, what's interesting about trauma, a common denominator about those that have experienced trauma is it became a trauma because you felt like you were alone in it. So when you think back, if you've experienced a trauma, if you were to think back and we were to do some digging, this isn't therapy, but if you were to do some digging, there was a part of it where you felt all alone. I find this in leaders that they're in burnout because they felt all alone in the journey. They didn't talk to anybody. Everything was okay until they realized it's not okay. What's interesting is you got there alone because you felt alone. But when you're in burnout, the opposite is true. If you study trauma and you study healing, you never recover from trauma alone. You can get there alone, but you don't get out alone. So you need somebody to do it with, right? So life. So I would encourage you this. Don't add something else to your to-do list. Like, we could give you a litany of things. The first step is this. Find somebody who's for you, who you trust, and allow them. They may not be the person that goes the whole journey, but they can help you get started. And let them, there's this idea in neuroscience, but like let somebody with a bigger brain that can think bigger and broadly for you, because you've got nothing left in the tank, to help make some decisions and connections for you that can get you moving in the right direction. Look, you didn't get there overnight. You're not going to get out of it overnight. It's a process, but you absolutely cannot get out or heal on your own. So take the assessment, see what it shows you. Find somebody you can trust that can at least help you take that first step of what should you do or who should you talk to. That might be it, not even doing, it's just talking to somebody. And then just let the steps begin to happen on their own or under the care of someone that can give you some more wisdom. So that's where I would say it. The final thing is this. If you feel burned out, like, you don't have to stay burned out. If you feel alone, you don't have to stay alone. If you feel sad and discouraged, you don't have to stay there. It's hard and it's hard to heal, but you don't have to stay there. And so the decisions that you took that got you there, hey, we're past that. Now you can make the other decisions that can get you out of there. You just got to make a decision at a time, okay? And you don't have to do this by yourself.
Oh, so good. Well, before we close, I'm going to ask you the question I ask all my podcast guests, okay?
Okay?
So this will hopefully be a little bit of a lift if this has
Yeah.
felt heavy. This is obviously called the Everything Made Beautiful podcast. We believe that God is making everything beautiful presently and in the life to come. And so, in that vein, if you could design your perfect, beautiful day,
Mm.
what would it look like from start to finish? And the caveat I give people is there's no limitations. So if you have
Oh,
allergies or you have gluten intolerance or anything like
yeah.
that, you don't have to have that in your perfect, beautiful day. So what
Yeah.
would yours be?
Probably throwing on my Speedo and just enjoying the day at the beach. I'm just kidding. You might want to edit that part out. That's just a joke. I don't
Nope,
wear
that
those.
stays in. That stays in.
I don't wear those. If you do, no judgment. You do you. You know what? This is going to sound maybe too simple. Removing the pressure that I owe something to someone.
Hmm.
Nobody's waiting on me for a meeting. Nobody's waiting on me to show up. Nobody's waiting on me to build something, design, speak it. You say, well, isn't that the work that you do? So you're like, that all wears you out. That's not what I'm saying at all. But I think if I had a day where the demand and the pressure was removed and I had the freedom to wake up and go eat a great breakfast, go for a walk, watch a movie, eat gummy bears, which I love, like for me, doing that type of thing all day, hanging out with my wife, Stacy, like we like to watch movies at house. Like we could watch one, then you want to go on a walk? Yeah, let's go on a walk. You want to drive up to so-and-so? Yeah, let's drive up to so-and-so. So I think the freedom to do all that and not feel the burden of responsibility that I often feel, and I don't mean that negatively, but the burden of responsibility that
Yeah.
gets lifted for a day.
Yeah. Ooh, I like that. I always want to enter into every perfect, beautiful day that every guest describes. And that one hits home for me. Like, what would it be like for no one to be wanting anything from me?
Yeah.
That feels like euphoria when I imagine it. So,
Yeah. One can
woo.
dream.
Yes, exactly. One can dream. Well, Jason, thank you for being on this show. I have a page full of notes, and I know that this has been a word in season for some people in some really specific things that they're walking through. And I've already been praying that the people that need to listen and watch this will listen and watch it. So if you are listening and watching, I prayed for you that you would have something that you could take away and walk away with that might give you hope in what can often be hard or exhausting seasons. So,
Yeah.
Jason, thank you. And thank you to Jonathan. If you will pass on our gratitude. Thank you for this book. I will put all the information in the show notes, but I'm so grateful that you joined us today.
Thank you, Shannon.
All right, guys, that does it for this episode of Everything Made Beautiful. And as always, I encourage you to be looking around for the ways that God is making everything beautiful, including you. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for joining us for Everything Made Beautiful. We are so grateful for your willingness to tune in. Be sure to follow, rate, and download the podcast and check out the show notes for additional links and resources from today's episode. You can follow Everything Made Beautiful podcast on Instagram and Facebook and can subscribe to Shannon's writing on Substack. This information and more is available at shannonsuzannescott.com. See you next time.